I want to go ahead and start us out by invoking what I think is one of the most simple and yet profound statements from uh, a sacred text, which is particularly important to my life, and that is the Gospel of Thomas. Number 5, Jesus says, realize what is in front of your face, and what is hidden from you will be revealed. So what this does is it points at the simplicity of what it is we're trying to get at in this talk. And, I'm a Chinese medicine practitioner, and so is Laura. And so we both come from a kind of a Taoistic influence. And you could almost consider this entire course a course on applied Taoism in a lifestyle quasi-clinical, if you want to look at it from a practitioner's lens point of view. And we're each our own practitioner. So, there's really, I love to address the practitioner community, but this talk is really for everyone, we think. What this does is it gets at the simplicity of what's trying to be said through us, through this conversation. And if you're familiar with Taoism, you'll notice that there's a kind of Taoistic implication here, right? That you don't get at the thing in itself by just through the name of it, or through some kind of relation with life that's superficial. In fact, all you have to do is, quote, realize what's in front of your face, and what is hidden will be revealed to you. So welcome to this course. I'm going to just rap here for quite a while about some of these insights that I've had over years of working with people and working with myself, which is, I put air quotes there because it's a misnomer. Now my computer's acting pretty funny. Keeps doing this. So anyway, onward and upward. So that's a misnomer too, Why's it got to be upward? So you don't need this course. And what I mean by that is I'm gonna refer to one of Ram Dass's one of the ways that he opened one of his talks called The Miracle of Consciousness. And what he says in this talk is, he says, you all have brought me here to you've paid $20 for me to be here. This is Ram Dass talking. And I know that there's nothing that I know that you don't already know. And how do I know that? He says, because I will say something infinitely wise. Ram Dass says, I will say something infinitely wise, and you nod your heads. So what is it that you paid me $20 to hear me say? Because you've already got it. You know it. You nod your heads at the wisdom. And so that is my way of I wish I could play the clip for you, but it's fantastic. And what he's getting at is that, again, this kind of Taoistic notion that we're going to touch on over and over and over in this course, that there's nothing lacking. There's nothing to do. There's nowhere to go. That said, there's a paradox here, right? So not only is there nothing to do and nowhere to go, but paradoxically, which is very important, it helps to have reminders. And so we are complete in ourselves. There's this idea that individuation and the alchemy of spiritual work in life takes this work. It's the magnum opus. It's the great work of transformation and just the blood, sweat, and tears and all these kinds of things. And that may be true to a certain extent depending on how you look at it, but we would like to highlight the completeness that you are already. And yet we're here, and this is a course, for lack of a better word. I like to just call it, this is just the one conversation. And this is the one conversation with the kind of the blank audience, So again, it's a paradox. It helps to have reminders, and it helps to be in community and be in relation with these things within yourself and with your life. But for instance, if you can get someone else to take this course, to listen to this conversation with you, then the conversation between people is what helps, for lack of to use the the frequent New Age physics metaphor. You get on the same wavelength. You're on the same frequency when you constantly touch on that. So, um, so well, that's a problem, and I'm going to go over here with this. Woo! That was fun, wasn't it? Um, so there's a few central theses here that we kind of like to continually poke at, and I've already kind of poked at a couple of them. And you might ask, like, what is the goal? Well, that's actually the next slide. We'll talk about that. But in terms of the theses, we might just say that ease of suffering, for lack of a better word. Now, I've paid homage to Taoism, and I will be doing that a lot here in this talk. But when you say something like ease of suffering, almost in a Buddhist sense, although I don't consider myself Buddhist, and if I did, I'm not a very good Buddhist. And even though these kinds of things may intimate things like Buddhism or Taoism, we're trying to just continue this conversation and kind of have this conversation, and keep this kind of tradition alive, and with language and perspective that may be new, may be novel, may not be. It's actually most certainly not. But for again, a lack of a better word, which everything is, for a lack of a better word, we're going to use the term suffering. So ease of suffering is arrived at through, which is bad English, I think, is arrived at through unity rather than separation. And how in these is this how about how we think about these things? Is it unity in how we think rather than separation in how we think, or is it in how we live? We're going to get at the when it says ontology rather than epistemology. We're talking about being here. We're actually trying to get away from how the mind runs our lives. But the unity versus separation conversation is a habit of the mind which is quite ancient, and it's either 10 plus thousand years of civilization and 400 years of materialist, scientific materialism drilling into our heads the idea of, the Cartesian dualism, and the idea that mind and body are separate, and poor relationships with power and with money and with these kinds of things that have kind of driven us away from our true, driven us away from being in right relation with our true nature. There's the civilizational, societal conditioning aspect, which is extremely important. I mean, deconditioning is a huge part of what we're doing here. I personally, I do human design and astrological work with people, and that is a large part of what we do. In fact, it's explicit in human design. The work is to decondition. But again, the work, right? How is there work when there's nothing to do and nowhere to go? It's a paradox, right? And so paradox rather than certainty is one of the other theses that we believe by, again, belief. So you'll find that throughout this talk, I use language to describe things, and then I immediately backtrack on what that language actually implies, because language is such a habit, and there's so much riding on these words, like, say, belief. Like, I mean, if we're going to have a conversation about the one thing, this ineffable truth that we'd like to point ourselves to in life, then what the hell do my beliefs have anything to do with it, right? So you could look at it as a deconditioning, a boundary dissolving component of this is is unbelief. Now that's not like disbelief, but it's unbelief in the same way that we're trying to work ourselves towards unwork rather than work, non-doing rather than doing in the Taoist sense, right? So the fact that we're constantly going to be invoking both polarities of something in order to kind of point at the truth is this paradox rather than certainty, right? Because scientific materialism and the intellectualism of the past few hundred and really, since the dawn of civilization, this idea of being certain and of our beliefs being the correct ones, which no culture has, that's not this explicit, that's not the specific purview of any one culture. I guarantee you. In fact, I mean, and this is not a judgment. We jump to, and it's actually, I mean, of course, it's hugely problematic. The Western mind and Western philosophy and Western civilization and the way in which that's been the dominant method of relating to the world and the kind of destructive effects it has had. But we can talk about indigenous cultures and the kind of honor code and certain not that I'm saying I'm not drawing generalizations here. I'm just saying that it is more likely, in the same way that unity and separation are paradoxically both involved here, and that this interplay between paradox and certainty and having to wrestle with these is actually more likely writ into the fabric of reality, and the fact that there's for a grossly lack gross lack of better explanation, there's a mind in here, you might say, right, that Connor Kees is somehow an instantiation of, and all this, like the ego talking. There's something making my mouth move and make these words come out, which, who knows? But um, a one way of saying this with fancier language, you might say, is that we're interested in ontology rather than epistemology. Ontology is the study of being. It's the study of what is, rather than epistemology, the study of knowledge. So rather than trying to arrive at right information or correct knowledge, we're actually just trying to be in right relation, a kind of holistic, interbeing, animistic, mystical relation with what is, with being itself, than trying to have the right facts stored in our heads. Because if we're letting our bodies and our lives and our souls take control, then the right information is going to just be in here. You're gonna know. So we'll get at that, but that's these are two of these things, and the third thing is surrender rather than striving. Again, this Taoist notion of non-doing rather than doing, and so much of what we struggle with and suffer with in life is our culturally programmed desire to exert our will upon the world so that our life is more in accordance with what we think is right, or what feels good to us. So on to the next. The goal. So again, right, goal is in quotation marks because there's no goal here, and of course it's more apt to think of this as a journey. It's apt to think of this as a story. It's apt to think of all of this as a process rather than a destination. So I want to kind of invoke Terence McKenna's common kind of rap about reality as language. Reality as language. Terence McKenna would say that your life is more like a sentence, or your life is more like a novel, right? Than what? Than say, uh, random assortment of atomic billiard balls bouncing around and Brownian motion and the diffusion of entropy, just metabolism and these kinds of things. So that's just silly, right? I mean, that's just a story that comes out of these 400 years of Cartesian, what Gordon White calls the Cartesian head trauma, and scientific materialism. It's actually, I mean, I'm gonna come out and say here that it's super duper important again for, none of this is important. You have to laugh when you really, especially as I'm trying to represent the way in which these things are not thought about, because it's not a matter of thinking, the way that they're just related to. um, this conversation is a demonstration of how we're constantly coming back to the Tao in our way of speech, right? And the Tao says that you the more you learn about it, the less you understand, right? So anyway, so reality is language, and life as story, and life is like this kind of novel that you're living is much more helpful than this dualistic, this scientific materialist explanation of life and biology and all these kinds of things, because it's devoid of meaning. There's no teleology. There's no meaning to what an organism does, right? So again, now to talk about contradiction. Um, see, it's imperative that we get comfortable with paradox when we talk about these things. Now, I point at the invoking the paradox by putting quotations around things sometimes, not always, but in this case, you might think of en- enlightenment, for lack of a better word, or sagehood, or sainthood, or these kinds of things as part of what it is that we're getting at. But the question is, what the hell does that mean? And of course, this is a huge question, and plenty of uh, Taoist and Buddhist and spiritual thinkers and seekers like we're trying to answer this. And where in our estimation, where it so often goes astray is where so quickly, so easily, a story of separation is invoked again. So in other words, there's those that have achieved enlightenment, and there's those that haven't, and that there is a recognition that's a failure to recognize, failure for lack of a better word, to recognize that this is a story and that there is no destination, right? And so the Tao Te Ching says that the Tao is nearby and easy to seek. And so we have to really take that to heart, And there's a story in the Zhuangzi, and I always butcher it, and I always say it, and I always butcher it every time. But I'm going to say it again, and that is that there's a student coming to the master Zhuangzi, and he said, "Master, you know, um, when will I achieve enlightenment?" Right? Or maybe it was how I achieve enlightenment. It doesn't matter. That is asking him a question about, like, how do I be basically, if I'm going to put it, kind of give an interpretation here, how do I become something other than what I am already right now? Because I value that. Because I value enlightenment. What do I want? I want enlightenment. So tell me how to get it. Tell me how to get that thing. And the story goes that in that moment, a book fell from the bookshelf over the student's head and hit the student on top of the head, and the student achieved enlightenment. Right? And I always pause because what the hell does that mean? What does that story mean? The idea is that it's fleeting. The idea is that you don't know where it comes from. Uh, is that a permanent? Are we supposed to believe that in that story that the book fell and hit this student on the head and they achieved enlightenment? They're, that story from the Zhuangzi itself is making fun of the term enlightenment. What the hell is enlightenment if it's something that you can get bonked on the head by a book and achieve. It's ironic, right? But we'll take it at their word that they achieved enlightenment in that moment. Does that mean it lasts forever? Does that mean they now get to wear a badge? That's they got hit on the head by a book and achieved enlightenment? No, right? What we're getting at is a way of being rather than a way of thinking. And I've kind of said this and alluded to this, but again, we're just going to continue to kind of have this conversation and hash this out. And I was advised by Laura actually, that metaphysics, and again, this is a paradox. This is a paradox, right? But metaphysics, at least the way that we kind of approach it, is in a way kind of necessary in order to debunk metaphysics. So the necessity, we'll talk more about metaphysics, but just kind of keep that in mind, that that's one of those paradoxical things where we're going to constantly be pointing at like things that involve polarity and duality and things like the mind and the soul, and that's metaphysics. That's metaphysics. But it requires, just in the same way that the Tao Te Ching, you move from the 1 to the 2 to the 3 to the 10,000 things, Taoist alchemy involves a moving backwards in that process, from the 10,000 things to the 3 to the 2 to the 1, right? And and that's a story. I don't want to get wrapped up in like that's the way, although I do have a lot of Taoist alchemical motifs in literature in here. I mean, sainthood, sagehood, these are, it's all in there. But just kind of want to continuously be pointing at the impossibility of actually saying what it is that through experience and through relating to the story of my life, say, in a way that greases the wheels of being, just the impossibility of actually saying that with words, because just like we said, right, paradox rather than certainty, the answer is always both and, neither or. It's always that way. So we have some aphorisms. That we constantly kind of come back to in this quote work, in this practice of unwork that we're doing, in the unwork that we're doing. There's nothing to do. There's nowhere to go. There's nothing to be other than what you are in this moment right now. You are perfect, and your life is perfect. That's a big one. You're perfect. You're perfect. The only thing wrong with your life is the idea that there is anything wrong with your life. Now, this is I can hear the whistles going off in regards to social justice, for instance. What about people who are suffering because they don't have enough food, right? I'm actually going to skip over that. Now, I think that if you take this work to heart, the answer is in there. If you take this, what do you call it? Again, see? And hell, I'm the guy giving this talk, you know? I think that the answer is in there. And I think that I'm going to invoke Eisenstein and say that there's something about the more beautiful world that our hearts know is possible. The more beautiful world that our hearts know is possible is in here. And if we were to stop and say, people are dying, people are suffering, people are getting blown apart, people are blowing people apart, people are starving, right? Then we have fallen back into a story of, and this is tough. This is really tough, but further from a recognition of what is, and this sounds like complacency, which is part of the reason why we purposefully wanted to call this why we wanted to call this radical freedom, radical surrender. You know, um, just chew on it. That's all. That's all. That's all. Or don't. But Ram Dass pointed to that where he would bring this up to Neem Curly Baba. Neem Curly Baba, his guru, and he would say, "But Master, look at all the people suffering. How can you say that everything is perfect?" And his guru would just say, "How can you say that everything isn't?" You know, something to that effect. He would just smile, and he would, it's kind of a condescending, kind of a condescending way. He would just smile and say, "Look around you. It is. It is." And so, you know, the Lord works in mysterious ways. That's not in here, but we could put that in here, couldn't we? So you're not in control of your life, and you never have been. Not one instant, not one moment of your life have you ever been actually in control of it. Now, that flies in the face of a whole lot of theory on free will and just all kinds of things and people's ideas about that healing takes work, and how can I not be in control if I need to heal these things and resolve my traumas and do all this kind of thing. And just take these aphorisms and allow them and chew on them and allow them to kind of resonate a bit and see how it feels. And we're gonna like, seeing how it feels is a large part of this. But and this one is tough, and I get a lot of flack for this one too. Although there's a quasi nihilistic, maybe like some kind of, you could call this some kind of spiritual determinism, or I've had the word nihilism thrown at me, which is ridiculous. Right? The word nihilism is the belief that nothing matters. And even though that's what that says right there, what happens what I mean is that when you stop allowing the mind to dictate what is important to you, then it actually levels the playing field, and everything begins to matter equally. Like the butterfly's wings flapping that causes the hurricane on the other side of the planet, like the people getting blown up and the people blowing the people up, right? So chew on these a little bit, and if you can find yourself resonating with this or thinking this, and again, I mean, you do think this is, the mind is constantly going. It does not shut off, really. I mean, yeah, you're gonna sit and meditate and achieve samadhi and do all that kind of stuff. That's not what this course is about. This course is not about meditating yourself into what we might call like an enlightened state, because it's not a state. It's flow. And so if you can find yourself flowing or resonating with any of these statements here, if they can kind of hook on or make any kind of sense to you, these can be really medicinal. These are the aphorisms these are some of the aphorisms that we often find ourselves coming back to. So here's where it's funny. I'm talking about the silliness of the mind, basically. And in order to keep things interesting and kind of appease that intellectual fancy that a lot of us have, and and it's just as much for me, I guess, as it is for anybody else. But I'm gonna kind of there are some $10 and $15 concepts and words in here. Again, the idea is that the more we learn about the Tao, the less we understand. It's like the more enlightened you become, the dumber you are, and that's good. Now that doesn't keep the quote mind that's quote in here from quote moving my mouth so that these words come out, and that those words can sometimes resonate with other ideological or intellectual concepts, which can sound fancy. Or hopefully, what the idea hopefully is that those concepts would actually point us to the big T truth, the truth. Okay. But here's some philosophies for grounding. And, I've got two Taoist works here, the Tao Te Ching and the Wu Zhen Pian. And I quote both of these throughout this talk. What do we get from these? They talk about enlightenment. There's this idea, there's nothing to do, there's nowhere to go. There's some Latin motifs in here that I've kind of pulled on just because some of us have heard them before. Amor fati, the love of fate. Memento mori, remember that you will die. Right? And the Tao Te Ching, especially in the in the Wu Zhen Pian, I mean they point at this paradox of being whole and complete in this moment, wherever you are, whoever you're with. John Martin, who's a human design guy, he has this quote where he's like, the blessing, or the gift is that you walk this universe alone, and the curse is that you walk this universe alone. And so there's these notions. I'm not saying that none of this is fact. So yeah, none of this is fact. But we can take in those ideas about the individuation and your holistic completeness. If there's nothing to do and nowhere to go, and you're perfect, how do I situate that with the paradox that, like, actually, hopefully, partaking in this conversation and having other people to partake in this conversation with is part of the process. So there's a mutual flourishing, there's a mutual deconditioning, and a mutual growth, flourishing, expansion. Something happens, right? We're so used to this language that, like, has a directionality to it. It's like ascension or these kinds of things. And a lot of if there's anywhere to be or to go that's not where you are in this moment, then that's a story of separation. Anyway, the Gospel of Thomas is one of the most important texts in my spiritual education. I don't know. But the big T truth is what I often refer to it as. And I think the Gospel of Thomas points at that in a big way. Gospel of Thomas also points at something that human design refers to as passenger consciousness. That's one of Ra Uruhu's terms, and I think it's a brilliant one. And passenger consciousness, because the Gospel of Thomas says, become passersby. Become passersby. And it also points at an appreciation for paradox rather than certainty. I'm realizing, the Corpus Hermeticum, I meant to include a prayer, or actually part of a prayer from the Corpus Hermeticum in here. And while this is it's absolutely integral to this whole conversation, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to point to it now, and we're going to know that it's implied. And I have a feeling that Laura is going to talk a lot more about this. I forgot to put that prayer in there, but we'll just say that, the Corpus Hermeticum, which is also a very important text to me, even though talk about metaphysics and talk about stories of separation and how we relate to the world and the mental stories, there is in this, particularly in the secret hymn in the back of the towards the end of the Corpus Hermeticum, there is a kind of fractal recursive uh, prayer where the person is saying that, like, um, through me your praises are sung, and through those praises being sung to you, that, you know, the light is shown back on me, which causes me to sing the praises. Which, so there's this kind of reciprocal feedback loop that's formed between the person who's praying and the divine. And Eisenstein and I guess, is it Thich Nhat Hanh? I believe Eisenstein says that Thich Nhat Hanh is the one who coined this term interbeing. Um, and interbeing is just, you know, it's the holism and the frankly unfathomable interconnectedness of all being, you know, is pointed at in that. And so we'll just kind of leave that at that, because I think that the other things on here, the Taoist concepts and the concepts from the Gospel of Thomas, will entertain us plenty. Um, and here's the Gospel of Thomas 3. My goodness. Excuse me, please. Here we go. If they say to you, look, the kingdom is in the sky, then the birds of heaven will go before you. Rather, the kingdom is inside of you, and it is outside of you. When you know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will realize that you are children of the living Father. Right? So what this, I mean, we've got a story of separation here. If they say to you, look, the kingdom is in the sky, and, you know, in other words, like when people, like these stories of ascension, when people go up or they pray up, you know, there's this upward motion to it, which I just heard someone recently point to the fact that uh, provided you're not a flat earther or whatever, you know, then we're actually on a globe. So up is actually just out. I think this was Eisenstein too, Charles Eisenstein, that, I think so, that pointed this out as well, that it's not up, it's actually just out in all directions. And that actually feels more holistic often than saying it's like you're on a plane and it's like up or down, up or down. It's when we look up from our vantage point, it's out. And so we first, you know, the first sentence here is actually tearing down those stories of separation, bringing us back into unity. Rather, the kingdom is inside of you and it is outside of you. In other words, both of those things, inside of you and outside of you, is the kingdom of heaven. What is the kingdom of heaven? It's the kingdom of heaven is that thing, which in Gospel of Thomas 5, at the beginning of this talk, we realized is in front of our face. You know, realize what is in front of your face, and that which is hidden will be revealed to you. They're talking about seeing the kingdom of heaven just in front of your face. It's right in front of you, they say, right? And when you know yourselves, then you will be known. That one's it's a little tricky, but what it does is it plays it offers a different interpretation, a different meaning to this Greek, you know, the Timet Noske, the know thyself that we often hear in in spiritual parlance, right? Know thyself. Well, when you know thyself, then again, it's a reciprocal feedback loop between inside and outside, between self and other, between, you know, our experience of the mind and our kind of like perception of the world and reality and what actually is, right? And so, just as how the kingdom is inside of you and is outside of you, then when you know yourself, then you will be known. And who will you be known by? You'll be known by, to invoke the Corpus Hermeticum, which has said it was not going to invoke the nous, the divine mind, for lack of a better term, and just to be metaphysical, ironically, everything, all being and what is, then you will be known. Being known is like, it's like being present with what is. And you'll know that you are children of the living Father. And so this just kind of situates us in the divine reality, this divine story that we're living. And so, um, I'm going to read something from the Tao Te Ching now. And this, I mean, I'm of the mind that if you were going to, so I don't know how much exposure anyone who's listening to this has had to the Tao Te Ching, but I mean, I'd like to say that I can't recommend it quite enough, and that, I mean, in many ways, in my opinion, it does not get any better. I like the Stephen Mitchell translation personally because it's the most poetic, it's the least literal, but in a way that retains its beauty. So the sage, the enlightened one, the sage, the saint, the master, whoever, leads by emptying people's minds and filling their cores, by weakening their ambition and toughening their resolve. The sage helps people lose everything they know and desire and creates confusion in those who think that they know. Practice non-doing and everything will fall into place. So what does the sage do? It empties people's minds and it fills their cores, the reality of who they are, their core being, who they actually are. And it weakens their ambition. So this is the surrender rather than striving, non-doing rather than doing. It weakens their ambition and it toughens their resolve. It gives them a spiritual strength. I mean, we're able to tap into this infinitely vast well of spiritual strength when we're in relation to what is, to the big T truth, to the Tao, whatever. The sage helps people lose everything they know and desire. How horrible that sounds, right? How horrible. And creates confusion in those who think that they know. When I do sort of spiritual mentorship, you might say, with the people that I work with, and I mean, I do this through whatever it is I'm whatever modality it is, or acupuncture, whatever. Human design is very good for this. When they say creates confusion in those who think that they know, what that is, that just means that we're identifying stories of separation and tearing apart those stories and bringing them back to unity, because unity involves paradox, therefore it's confusing, right? Practice non-doing and everything will fall into place. That sounds like a kind of faith. That sounds like a kind of faith in what's going on. And what's interesting here is that, yes, this is arrived at through relation with what is, through relation with the big T truth, with the Tao. But it's explicit that it takes community, and that it's kind of like a spiritual virus, for lack of a better word, right? It's a good thing, I mean, your body is expressing this genetic material to update the whatever. So, but the sage leads by emptying people's minds. This is the sage doing it through its relation with other people. And so you are that sage. You are that sage, right? I've said this before, but what I like to refer to this as is the one conversation of identifying stories of separation. Just like this says, it leads by emptying people's minds, right? Identifying stories of separation, right? And it creates confusion in those. You identify those stories which are taking as a metaphysical or intellectual reality as truth, separation. And then you're saying, but for real though, I mean, you're kind of asking, just, are you sure? And we'll talk about the work of Byron Katie and stuff, but that's the first step. Is, I mean, we just talk about stories, and when I'm working with clients, it's as simple as me saying, like, that's a story. I hear a story. I hear you talking, and I hear certainty, and I hear that we're feel pretty sure about what it is that we're thinking. You know, I hear a story, and so, and then by bringing us back to unity and kind of just calling into question our certainty about things, we can come back to what I call the big T truth, because there's a lowercase t truth, which is that certainty, which is that scientific materialist empiricist notion that Western placebo controlled, double blind, randomized controlled, trials are the arbiter of all truth. And so that when you call that into question, that little T truth, it allows us to say, isn't life a little more interesting than that? I mean, can't we? And again, now here's what's interesting. Paradoxically, that's a story. We'll get to that. What I call the primacy of story. Um, but um, yeah. And in doing so, I just had to say, it's the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. So what we're pointing at is, when we point to unity and away from separation, we're pointing to something that, because it is unity, necessarily involves a paradox and cannot be said explicitly. It can only be pointed at. Right? We can kind of circle the drain here, right? We can't necessarily just say, oh yeah, this is the truth. Let me tell you what the truth is. There's no such thing. I have other terms for this, and so I call it like touching the bottom, or just like shedding illusion, because it feels like that sometimes. You're just like, oh God, that's right. It's not. I don't know. I'm not as certain as I'd like to believe I am, because believing that I'm certain feels safe, and it's what the master does, right? Helps people lose everything they know and desire, right? Um, yeah, touching the bottom, like touching the bottom of the pool. We swim down, we dive down, and we touch that bottom. And that doesn't mean you don't place your finger there, because for heck's sake, you would drown. If you're touching the bottom of the pool and you're keeping your finger there, you would just drown, right? So you have the experience of touching the bottom of the pool, and you come back up. And so that's the point in the conversation, the one conversation where I like to say there's nothing left to be said. And it is when you reach that point in talking to someone, there's kind of a stillness, there's kind of a quietness, right? And it does create confusion in the person that you're talking to. And this is why I encourage, like we've said, like, have another person go through this course with you. Talk about truth. Talk about the big T truth. Invoke your own uncertainty and the inherent doubt that you have, um, about these ideas that we cling on to, with another person, and see what happens. Right? I'm not terribly versed in this. I've not actually practiced this myself, but I'm aware of it, and it's. I was aware of like the method. It was called the work. Ironically, it's called the work of Byron Katie, and who Byron Katie, by the way, this is just awesome and serendipitous and cool. Byron Katie is actually the wife, if I'm not mistaken, is the wife of Stephen Mitchell, who is my favorite translation personally of the Tao Te Ching. So if you get the Tao Te Ching, and his is called the Tao Te Ching, right, which is the Wade Giles way of transliterating it. The Byron Katie and Stephen Mitchell are married, as far as I understand, and so it's cool to have both of them in this talk, in that respect. So see how this is. I mean, and this is the work of Byron Katie. This is what she does with people. Question one is it true? You have a thought. I am XYZ. Now, when we get to having these conversations and you start to realize the difference between a story of separation and a story of of unity, you'll realize that saying anything after anything I am XYZ is putting a conditional. I got this from Laura. It's putting a condition on your soul. It's putting a condition on your existence. When the reality is, I am. You know, and that's scriptural. That's biblical. That's Hebrew, right? I mean, that's Eye Asher Eye. I am that I am, right? But whatever the question is, you can, or the statement, the thought. I think she refers to it as a thought. But belief is also, you could say thought or belief or statement. Is it true? Question 2. Can you absolutely know it's true? So I love that 2 is just a recapitulation, but harder, of 1. 1 is it true? 2 is, are you sure? Are you really sure that it's true? Like, for real? And the answer, I mean, I think to any of those, with any statement, is, are you sure that it's true? Is, provided I'm trying to say it with my mouth, you know, and it's not something I know and know, maybe with a capital G, know, like the like divine knowledge, like that I have understanding in my heart, that it's like written on my heart. That's a different kind of knowledge. Provided I'm trying to express it, and it's like trying to go from my mouth into your ears and then be stored in your brain as fact, then the answer is no. Can you absolutely know that it's true? No. The answer is no. I mean, and 2,500 years of Western's philosophy, you know, and Greek philosophy and Eastern philosophy have all been pointing at that. The Tao Te Ching points at that, right? Naming something is meaningless, right? So what happens in you, question 3, when you believe that it's true, I am XYZ? What happens in you when you believe that that's true? And so a lot of people, they have self-deprecating stories about themselves, and they'll say, I am blah, 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 right? And ask them how that feels. Like, how does it feel to say that about yourself? You know, because I don't think it's true. In fact, I know it's not true, and I know it's actually, you actually can't know that it's true. Like, again, paradoxically, how do I know that? You know, it's more about talking about, when we say no in this case, we're talking about the nature of knowledge itself. Because again, we're getting at an ontology, being, rather than epistemology, knowledge, right? Question 4 is, who would you be without this belief? So often our stories do point to those self-deprecating, self-abnegating stories of self-pity and self-limitation, you know? So say, I mean, are you sure is that true for real? Okay, well, how do you feel when you believe that? Entertain for a second the idea of just not believing that. How do you feel if you just didn't believe that? What would that feel like? Often feel better, right? And so they say to turn it around. After question 4 is when you do repeat questions 1 through 4, but you consider its opposite, right? So is the opposite of that true? That's when some stories might come in. Can you be sure that the opposite of that isn't true? What happens when you believe that the opposite of that is true? You know? So this is called the work of Byron Katie. This is what she does with people. And I think it's elegant and brilliant and simple. And just to be ironic, I think it's true. You know what I mean? So I don't know if this is how terribly heretical this is, but I don't have my copy of the Wujin Pian with me. Now you can find translations of the Tao Te Ching online, but I don't have my copy of the Wujin Pian with me. So these are from memory, and some of them I've purposefully kind of fiddled with, as it says in the first line here. But anyway, just bear with me. If you've got the English translation of the Wu Jin Pian, or Awakening to Reality by Fabrizio Pregadio, I highly recommend it. I highly recommend this text. It's a Taoist alchemical text, so a lot of it is metaphysics, but then they have things like this. So how paradoxical is that? That is metaphysical. And on the other hand, you have things like this. When will you stop fiddling with your nose and learning how to roast seeds? Right. So this is a reference to the kind of qigong and Taoist alchemical, what we would call the Waidan, or the Ming body focused traditions, of the purification of the essence, and the qigong and stuff like that in Taoist alchemical practice, right? So when will you stop fiddling with your nose, like pranayama, basically? When will you stop fiddling with your nose and learning how to roast seeds? Will you leave your family and flee to the mountain just to watch the wind blow the reeds? So think about what they're saying. It's like so much of this stuff, when it comes to this question of enlightenment, and like, how do we do this? How do I get there? How do I get to this destination of enlightenment? Um, they're making fun of it. Quit fiddling with your nose and trying to learn how to roast the seeds correctly so that they will become like an immortality tonic. And are you going to just run away from your family and live in the mountains so you can watch the wind blow the reeds? Right? They're making fun of it. They're saying, you fool. It says you must learn to practice the reversal while in the marketplace. Practicing the reversal is that going from the myriad things, the 10,000 things, to the three, to the two, to the one, moving backwards through the assumption of this intellectual understanding of metaphysics back to the Tao, back to unity, and away from separation, where we accept paradox, where we accept surrender, right? You must learn to practice the reversal while in the marketplace, right? So that, to me, I mean, I used to study Taoist alchemy from um, a more Ming or body focused kind of lens, and I was all engaged in like, how do you do microcosmic orbit, and how do you the pranayama techniques, and the breath work, and all these kinds of things, where people become obsessed over. And it says right here in the like founding text of the I believe it's the Beit Song lineage, um, of Taoist alchemy, that you must learn to practice the reversal in the marketplace, which is such a different idea entirely than what people are used to. The idea of sitting and meditating and trying to achieve samadhi, because they're thinking of enlightenment as a destination, right? So I mentioned this. I used this term before. This is a term that I use where I just call it greasing, um, reality, greasing the wheels. Sorry, greasing the wheels. And so greasing the wheels is what some stories do, and some stories don't. So the primacy of story, I mentioned this earlier as well. This is the necessity. I'm sorry. The primacy of story is. I'm sorry. The primacy of story is the fact that the mind operates through story, and so it can actually do no other than to um, to try and comprehend reality through story. It's a necessity of how the mind comprehends reality or anything. Um, and so what's interesting about that, and it's complicated because it gets at, and who cares that it's complicated, because we love paradox, right? It gets at the paradox of this duality that's somehow inherent within a world that is truly one and unified, right? And so the mind versus the world, why would that even be the case? Why are we having this conversation if everything is unified, Connor? If everything is, if I'm reading the Tao Te Ching and I'm taking it to heart, and that the Tao is just is just, nearby and easy to seek, why is it that I have to seek it in the first place? Well, the answer to that is you don't have to do anything, because the idea that you have to seek it, that there's somewhere to do and something to do and somewhere to go, that's that story of separation. So the mind just constantly is falling back into this duality, and given the primacy of story and the necessity of story for how the mind apprehends reality, we can grease the wheels, so to speak, by having stories that point our hearts toward the truth, right? So certain stories grease the wheels while others create friction, and they activate the mind, and certain stories will actually cause the mind to just keep spinning faster, right? So and we'll get to more about like mental pressure and stuff like that, but like I said, greasing the wheels means orienting the mind towards the truth. And it's the stories that we allow to color how we fall into relation with life. So it's not just orienting the mind, it's greasing the wheels means, do our stories point our heart towards what actually is, right? How addicted are we to certainty? This is a big part of this. How addicted are we to the idea that there's something to do, somewhere to go, and we have to strive to get there because we're incomplete. I mean, I think this is some of the most incredible stuff. Can you coax your mind from its wandering and keep to the original oneness? Can you let your body become supple as a newborn child's? Can you cleanse your inner vision until you see nothing but the light? Can you love people and lead them without imposing your will? Can you deal with the most vital matters by letting events take their course? Can you step back from your own mind and thus understand all things? I just don't think it gets any better than that, you know? So this is, it's funny because we're talking about stories of separation and stuff. And here I am with a side title like demoting the mind. So again, this is all tongue in cheek in a way. And I hope, I hope you can appreciate that. But, just for dramatic purposes, we're gonna use words like demoting the mind. So let's ask ourselves, what is the mind for? And I've alluded to this in this talk. It's for the retention and dissemination of information. So when I learn some lowercase k knowledge, some lowercase t truth, some what better known as facts, these kinds of things, or even concepts and how certain concepts or ideologies are related, the mind is for taking that stuff in and being able to store it, and having it ready when you need to, BS about some stuff or know how to operate a machine, right? Or something like this. This is what the mind is for. Okay. The other thing the mind is for navigation, orientation of the body in 3D space. So these are two ways of I just like to kind of point people to these two things that the mind does, which is really exceptional at. It's a whole lot better at doing these two things than it is at allowing the stories that govern our relation with the world to make life easier and simple and carefree and free of suffering for us, right? It doesn't do that very well. So I have a metaphor that I use when I talk about the soul versus the mind. Again, story of separation, soul versus the mind. I was once asked on a podcast, the first question I was asked in the interview is, how do we unify the mind, body, and spirit, right? How do we unify the mind, body, and spirit? And my answer was, what is there to unify? They're already unified. And the extent to which we can take that in and take it seriously and take a deep breath, when we consider the unification of these things, that there's no thing to do and nowhere to go, it makes so many of these questions about, should I meditate every day? Should I be vegan? Should I be carnivore? You know, am I practicing my pranayama correctly? Because I want to extend my life. I got to extend my life. These kinds of things makes it all just seem uh, a lot less relevant to what you're actually here to do. So there's this metaphor where the soul sits in the control panel seat and it overlooks the factory floor, where the mind is out on the factory floor operating all the equipment because it's good at that, knowing where things go and all that kind of stuff. But the soul is up in the control tower, and the control panel in the control tower is actually ergonomically designed so that the soul doesn't even have to touch any of the buttons. It's like the soul telepathically controls this high-tech control room, right? And so the soul just kind of sits in the control room, and its very presence in the control room, control room, uh, governs the whole thing effortlessly. The soul's presence there is all that's necessary. And so what happens is the mind on their lunch break, they drink a whole pot of coffee, and then they run down the hall and they go to the control tower, and they kick down the control room door, and they point their finger at the soul and they say, "Hey, Mr., Mrs., I know what I'm doing. I know better than you. Why don't you step aside and let me take care of this?" And so the mind jumps in there because it's just it has this tendency to do this. It's loud, you know, that still small voice. That's not the mind we're talking about. I think that's something else, right? It's not the mind. So this loud kind of dominating mind gets in there and starts banging its head on the control panel. And so it's not only is it banging its head on all the buttons, creating a whole bunch of stories for us to believe, right? But it's trying to operate equipment that's not even ergonomically designed for it. It's like it's a whole nother creature. It does not belong in the control room. The mind belongs on the factory floor, doing what the mind does, right? So, you know, I've used that metaphor a lot, and it seems to make a lot of sense to people. But I have some. I'm paying homage here to the Corpus Hermeticum, this Greek text. That there's something in here about when we read something like, so if someone were to go and or if you're already familiar, a copy of the Corpus Hermeticum, and you read this complex metaphysics about how men are endowed with, humankind is endowed with nous, or the divine mind, and God is the eye of the eye of nous, and to partake of nous is to obtain divine knowledge, and just this pretty interesting but pretty wacky stuff. What I like it, you remember what I said, is that what I like about it is its invocation of the concept of interbeing, and how prayer is a singing of praise to the one and the all, which gives its blessings in return for the praise being sung, which then causes those prayers and those praises to be sung, and that's a reciprocal feedback loop. But there's something in here about the divine mind, nous, the divine mind. My question to a scholar of Greek Hermetic philosophy or something, would be something as simple as, like, does the divine mind even think? Because there's a whole lot in the Corpus Hermeticum about it says, holy is God, the Father of all, whose will is accomplished by his own powers. Um, and whose will is accomplished by his own powers. So, in other words, that's kind of like the soul sitting in the control room, not having to do anything. So, the soul and the divine part of us, that divine spark in us, is an embodiment of that wu wei in the Taoist sense, that non doing, that superior virtue, right? So, okay, it's a little bit of a fine point, but I thought to put in this idea of nous in here just to note that, like, as we're reading these things, I mean, as we start to orient ourselves, grease the wheels to these stories, um, and invoke that big T truth in our lives and in our relations, then as we're reading metaphysical treatises on XYZ, we can point out those stories of separation. We can hear them screaming separation. And even in something that may look like it at first or not look like it, we can start to just appreciate uh, everything becomes a retelling of the one story. It's like the one conversation is always being had, and we're always being pointed back to the truth by our exposure to things which ostensibly act as if that would seem like they know, right? You know, in Taoist alchemy, there's a concept of what's called Shen versus Yuan Shen. The Shen is the thinking spirit, and the Yuan Shen is the original spirit. So it says that the Shen, or the thinking spirit, the active spirit, loves it loves talking, it loves thinking, it loves activity. Whereas the original spirit, where we're going from the three to the one, the two to the one, back to the Tao, where the method of reversal, in reversing the light, practicing the reversal, when we go from the myriad things, the 10,000 things, where we're instantiated in this body and we have this mind, etc. That's a story of separation, right? But we're here. There's this thing happening. Supposedly, there's this thing happening, and there's paradoxically this impetus to go backwards to the original, to our true natures, to our essence, to our original essence. And that in the sense of the spirit, or the Shen, would be the Yuan Shen, the original Shen, which loves stillness. And so just pointing out two more like complexities about the theory of like mind and what mind has to do with this, where now when I read the Corpus Hermeticum and I hear divine mind, it's not the same as thinking that God is someone who thinks, I mean, it's said in scripture, like there's this idea that angels, for instance, don't have free will. Angels don't have free will, and that's part of supposedly like what makes human beings so dangerous is that we have free will. Well, I wonder if that goes all the way up, though. I mean, it says again, the Corpus Hermeticum, God whose will is accomplished by his own powers. So his gender normative theology aside, the power, the divine power, accomplishes the divine will, but it doesn't do anything. It doesn't. God does not have to strive. God does not strive to bring about the divine will. So this is a really fun part of this talk because it gets into some of the things that I do with people. This is a quote by the founder of Human Design, who is an extremely kooky person. Went by the name of Ra Uruhu when he changed his name. It's a whole thing. You're welcome to look into it. You're welcome to talk to me about it. So what he said is, there is magic within each of us to fulfill the possibility of the performance that is inherent in what we are. And it is not just that we are here to be these silent, cognitive, wise folk, right? No, no. It's about entering into a new level of social interaction that has nothing to do with survival and has everything to do with awareness. I love how he's talking about the performance that is inherent in what we are. We're living a story, right? We'll talk more about what human design refers to this as. I think it's absolutely brilliant. Human design people who study with Ra said we have to forgive Ra. He was human. That's what my human design mentor always says. She says you have to forgive Ra. He was human. You know, boy, did he have some guru vibes. You know what I mean? He had some major guru vibes. But here he is pointing to it. I mean, he's saying like we're not here to be these silent, cognitive, wise folk. These enlightened ones. We don't go to the mountains to watch the wind blow the reeds. We have to learn the reversal while we're in the marketplace, right? It's about entering a new level of social interaction. Isn't that interesting? That again, it's the sage who teaches others by their presence. So your being in right relation with being is part of the education of the entire universe. It's maybe one way of saying that, right? Um, Goodness, it's the sensitivity of the scroll on this mouse that keeps switching these slides. Nothing to do with survival, right? And everything to do with awareness. We're not striving to accomplish these things, or even this. I mean, that's it. That's taking it to a whole nother level. Actually, it doesn't even have to do with survival. It just has to do with awareness and presence, right? So, for those of you who aren't familiar with human design, this is a little brief slide on kind of some of the things that I've learned through my mentor about human design, and through the work of John Martin. He's the human design person who he has quite a personality himself, but I appreciate his work more than anybody's that I've seen who lectures on human design. There's a concept in human design called mental pressure. And that mental pressure is something that I've kind of alluded to, where when we orient ourselves to stories of unity rather than stories of separation, when we grease the wheels, okay, when we point our heart to the truth, there's this feedback loop where the stories that we relate to in life, we hear the separation talking in them. And when we hear the separation talking in them, we don't recoil. It's not like we're like, but we are reminded through the story of separation, the truth of the unity, which is ineffable. And you see it everywhere. It's perpetual. You see that separation in absolutely everything. You see it in yourself all the time. I mean, you know, think about how long it took me just in getting this conversation started before I got to where the language that I was using was comfortably in that for lack of a better term, non-dual realm. Again, lack of a better term, non-dual. Non-dual is not the right word for it, because it's not that it's non-dual. I mean, it is dual, and it isn't, right? Paradoxically. But when you relate to the truth, and your mind has this orientation which is constructive to being in right relation, then you can hear the monkey mind. You can kind of for me, and I think this is how it's said that it's experienced often for people in human design, is that there's a mental pressure. And if you know about human design, I'll say that none of anything on this slide has anything to do with gates or channels or open or defined centers or anything like that. So just forget that, because you could have a defined head center and you still have this mental pressure. You could have an undefined or completely open head center, and it doesn't matter. You can still have that self not self theme come in. Okay, so it's a mental pressure, and for me, I feel like something pressing on my head. I feel like someone is in there. It's kind of sometimes in this work / unwork of relating to these concepts, I have referred to this as kind of a like a healthy schizophrenia, for a talk about lack of a better word, a healthy schizophrenia, right? Because there's a pressure, and you start to be able to hear your mind talking to you, and you realize in hearing this mind talking, sometimes you just ask the question, who the hell is that? And why are you trying to tell me these things? Why are you trying to tell me what it is I am, what it is I should be, what it is I'm not, what it is I need to do, what it is I should be, where I should be going or focusing my energy, rather than being right here, right now, and appreciating this moment and appreciating the wholeness and completeness and perfection of what is, right? So there's a mental pressure, and you can hear that thing talking, and you feel it sometimes in your head. I do. And you just hear it. It's like it's a buzzing, annoying thing. It gets to be this kind of obnoxious little gremlin in your head, aka your flippin' mind, which has always been there and has always been lying to you your whole life. So I mean, this is where we're to the point in this where in this talk where um my objective is not to get judgy about the reality of the mind, but I think that um being in orienting ourselves this way, sometimes it can help to just release that pressure of like, dude, this mind, um it's if we're believing that the stories that it's telling us, and those stories are stories of separation, there's a whole lot more damage than it does good, right? There's this idea in human design that the mind is an overdeveloped organ, and that the mind, I thought that was the funniest thing when I heard that. My mentor said that to me one day, and she was like, yeah, the mind is a overdeveloped organ. And of course, if you wanted to be materialist about it, you could say that by extension the brain, but aren't the brain and the mind the same thing? No. um, you know there's this huge concept in human design that the mind is not for making decisions. No. When it comes to life or love or career or moving or those kinds of things, or anything big, or even the small things, do you want chocolate ice cream? Do you want vanilla ice cream? Right? When it comes to any of these things, the mind is not what's going to get you to the correct answer. If you have to reason your way into whether or not you want chocolate or vanilla, you may very well be unsatisfied. It's not a matter of rationale or logic, right? And sometimes weighing pros and cons about if you're going to move here or take this job or whatever, that's often separating us from the truth, rather than listening to our bodies, listening to where we are and appreciating where we are, and doing what we honestly, intuitively know and feel is, for a lack of a better word, right. And it's not even that it's right, it just is. The answer becomes obvious. It's just what's in flow. Okay. um I've pointed out that the observation / awareness of the mind and of the illusion of life, which in Vedic philosophy is referred to as Maya, and human design refers to it as Maya as well. Um, right. It's a Taoistic idea too that um, the naming is the beginning of like losing our understanding of the truth when we name things, right? So that means that the way that we experience the world cognitively is nothing but an adaptation. It's nothing but lies on top of this experience, right? Does that mean it's bad? No. That means we just orient ourselves appropriately to the truth. We fall into right relation, right? Listening to and being led by the body rather than the mind. Human design is all about your quote design or your body. Listening to your body and to how that guides you, right? The same thing I've been saying. Um, the human design calls it the life. It's called the life. It's just called the life, right? And so it's not your life. It says you are a cell in the life. This big story, this big process of which you are not in control. And so our goal is to be led by and appreciate our body's guidance through this process of being in the life and just passively participate. And Ra Uruhu, like I said, calls this passenger consciousness. You're a passenger here. So, um, there you go. You know, Gospel of Thomas 42, Jesus said, become passers-by. And gosh, when I first started reading the Gospel of Thomas, that one made no sense to me. And now it's like, holy crap, it's everything. It's like, you're not here in this life to figure out X, Y, or Z. There's nothing to do. There's nowhere to go, right? Um, Again, ontology rather than epistemology, being rather than knowledge. Metaphysics is dead, Heidegger said, right? Because Heidegger's main concern was to answer the question of the meaning of being, right? And Eisenstein says this brilliant thing where metaphysics is an attempt at giving our minds permission to believe the contents of our experience. So we know we're there's the contents of our experience, but the metaphysics is our way of kind of trying to cognize our way into feeling good about talking about what it is that we know through our experience to be reality, you know. um I'm going to leave this for part two. You know, I think Laura is going to talk about the numinous in with far more eloquence than I can, but I've said a few times that what we're getting at here is a deep interrelation with all things and with everything that is, and there's this unfathomable interconnectedness, this interbeing, which by trying to strive against, they call that nifa in Taoist alchemy. They call it flowing against, right? By doing rather than non-doing, you're actually striving against what is. You're trying to press against reality and trying to make reality into something that it's not. And so, you know, before intense metaphysics, before um, language even, there was simply the understanding that reality is pregnant with something. And I just consider for a moment that maybe that's enough. It doesn't have to be angels or ancestors or neutrinos or God. You know, I'm a person of faith for sure. I'm not saying that the concept of God isn't useful, but um, I guess yeah. You know, I mean, is it necessary? Reality is pregnant with something, and and that's enough. And if you've got that, and you then act from that place, you know, a kind of a faith based life in a way, um, then I think that's plenty. Personally, um, here it is. Here we are, but we're talking about metaphysics. So here it is. Verse 1 of the Tao Te Ching: the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. The unnameable is the eternally real. Naming is the origin of all particular things, right? I'm a southerner, so I have to, this is where I say, Lord have mercy. This slide. So when I had more of a interest in metaphysics and these kinds of things. There's so I have a saying that I've mentioned it on the Coherent Soulcast, and um, I often like to say, and it's a metaphor, right? It's a metaphor because I just said in a prior slide that is it even uh, does it make sense to think about God as even having free will as we would like to think of it? Does that make sense? I don't know, but um, I often will say that not a proton in this universe moves without God's explicit permission. And so that arises out of this. Again, this is, remember, like kind of spiritual determinism, where we are calling into question our assumptions about the nature of free will, and the idea that we're in control of this whole thing. There's understandings. Now, again, lowercase t truth, but there are observations and understandings, take it or leave it, in quantum mechanics, quantum biology, um, that point to this, that point to, and for instance, okay, the amount of energy in 1 cubic centimeter of space. This is the observations of Nassim Haramein, who's Unified Space Memory Network. He runs the Resonance Project, of the Resonance Science Foundation, and some of his calculations bear this idea that in 1 cubic centimeter of space, there's more energy than, say, the mass of all stars in the universe, right? And so that's ridiculous. I mean, that's like crazy. And so when you think about the fact that the amount of actual latent like it's there, the amount of energy in 1 cubic centimeter of space is practically, to our minds. I mean, it's infinite. I mean, come on. Does it have to be technically mathematically infinite for us to just say, fine, it's infinite, So the observation that he makes there is that with that amount of energy, how is anything stable? The strong force and the weak force, and these four fundamental forces in the standard model don't account for this. They don't account for the fact that we shouldn't be here. We should be, you know, just completely obliterated in the unfathomable fire of an infinite number of suns. That's how much energy there is here in the kind of the quantum flux, and in the vacuum. They call it a vacuum, ironically, right? It's not a vacuum. It's literally pure energy. So how are we here? And he says, like, if one proton were to get off the tracks, let's say that one proton were to just make one wrong move in that incredibly superfluid dynamic system where everything is so intricately interrelated. If one proton were to make one wrong move, he says, the whole thing would fall apart. We'd just all instantly disappear, vaporize, pure energy. But it doesn't. So that's profound, I mean, that's incredibly profound. And so there's other things like, I have quantum biology here. That's a big thing. I mean, if you're interested in this, I recommend checking out season 1 of my podcast, Making the Medicine, which is a podcast on a combination of Chinese medical, or Chinese kind of metaphysics, and quantum biology, and kind of what those two have to say about one another, at least in my estimation. One of the things that I get at is abiogenesis, the fact that it's statistically, there's two ways of looking at this. One is that it's statistically impossible for life to have formed in the primordial soup of amino acids and nitrogen and, you know, acidic ocean water, and it's just not it's just not possible. I mean, they've run the statistics on this. Like, what's the likelihood of life forming on Earth? There is none. There is none. It's not possible, statistically speaking. Again, the question of like what's infinite. Well, yeah, it's basically impossible, right? And so there's another way of looking at this, which is one of the things that I love to talk about, is that it's if you look at the quantum electrodynamics of water and how water is structured, and how it moves from H2O to H3O2, moves from these little Mickey Mouse patterns to this hexagonal pattern and forms these exclusion zones, and then has a piezoelectric structure which pulls charge from the quantum foam, from the ether, right, and how it interacts with light and all these kinds of things. It actually becomes the case that the formation of life is inevitable rather than impossible. So it's kind of cool. Either way you look at it, either way you look at it, um, it's pretty damn amazing that we're here. So it could either just be impossible, like kind of like the Big Bang. Like I love it. Terence McKenna used to say that the scientists, you know, in all their certainty, would have you believe the absolute limit case for credulity, that everything appeared out of nothing instantly for no reason, right? You know, evolutionary theology and the idea that like evolution in a species, say, or in a population of organisms, happens in these incredible leaps, and they've got evidence for this now, that it's not this random mutation or this selection process that's Darwinian mumbo jumbo. I'm a little cynical about this, you know. Life is intelligent, and that includes life itself, not just like, well, I don't mean biological organisms and units in an ecosystem or whatever. I mean life, like with a capital L. There's an intelligence being expressed through this, and that was just the idea that I'm just pointing out the idea that like evolution has been shown to happen in very rapid spurts, where a whole population will, boom, they'll suddenly update their characteristics in accordance with their environment, um, all at once, and it will be a demonstrable change. So it's not like, you know, what we learned in our textbooks. Um, you know, psi phenomena, near death experiences, telepathy, um, the list goes on and on. Anyone who is going to sit there and tell you, because they've got a Cartesian dualist, scientific materialist ideology about the world, anyone's going to sit there and tell you that your your appreciation for psi phenomena, extrasensory perception, and these kinds of things, anyone's going to sit there and tell you that that's all bunk, is doesn't know what they're talking about. They've not availed themselves of the research that's out there, decades and decades and decades of incredible research. Some of it, if you look into Dean Radin's work, is just remarkable. The remote viewing stuff, I mean, it's all out there. And so when you look at the way in which everything is connected, and like to start with this Planck density thing, okay, you look at the way that everything is connected and the way that everything speaks to this incredibly guided process, this story, there's actually every reason to just let go of the steering wheel and to trust in what's happening, rather than believing that there's something to do, somewhere to go. And so, you know, we could call that like radical faith, right? Um, This is sort of a revelation from a conversation again with Laura, that often what we say when we talk about the heart or heart centered in the West, like in yoga tradition, or not the actual yogic tradition, but like westernized yoga, the influence of positive psychology, I think, is interesting here, where we think of heart centered as a kind of loving, or even if it's heart centered in, like, in, say, the Marian tradition, which I think Laura is again also going to have more to say about. Um, there's a whole lot of influence from this kind of optimistic, positive psychology, right? Where I'd like to offer that unconditional love, like the unconditional love of God, is not a fuzzy love. I mean, the oxytocin that you get from that would, I mean, of course, it'd probably just fry your brain, and the dopamine would just fry your brain. If we want to look at it this way, I'm being silly, but to think about it as being something which is all consuming and boundary dissolving. So, again, I'm kind of, this is more a preface, I think, to what Laura's talk will be about, especially the idea of the heart in Chinese medicine. What is the heart in Chinese medicine? It's a complex topic because it's the pictogram for the heart. Qin is a heart. It's a heart. It looks like a heart, right? But the heart is the seat of the emotions. It's also where the emotions flow through. It's why one of the causes of all disease in Chinese medicine is the retent holding emotions in the body, right? So the heart is the seat of the emotions. It's the mind, the heart and the mind, and the center. You know how we say in English, like, the heart of something is its center. Well, the heart means all these things. And so when we say something is heart centered, there's um, there's a whole lot that comes into that may actually not be as relevant to. And I'm kind of just picking on the spiritual community at this point, but I'd like to kind of point out the way that some of these things are used is not. Um, it's sometimes we can be covertly expressing those stories of separation, and I'm not trying to be a jerk here, but uh, I had this kind of thought, and I wanted to put this slide in here as well. So the heart, I mean, really, if you're going to ask me in my kind of quasi non-metaphysical metaphysics, I would just say that, it's that which mediates between our experience of the world and how we try and cognize it and comprehend it and put it in the stories, the mind, and the truth, the reality of things, what actually is, right? This is one of my favorite. I mean, this is tough, but right. So yesterday you rode through town on horseback. Today you are a corpse, asleep in your coffin. 100 years is a spark sent forth from a stone. An entire lifetime is a bubble floating on the water. Right. So some of those ideas that these get at is this kind of remember that you will die. This memento mori, this death based reasoning. Death based reasoning is, to me personally, it's essential. It's crucial, right? And love of fate, amor fati. I mean, this is that radical faith and that passenger consciousness. The idea of saying, "I'm just here, observing," right? Where life and reality are a story. It's more like a novel, right? More like a sentence, more like a novel than it is a game. There's not something to win. The idea that you need to do this in order to be perfect, to achieve, to accomplish, to strive. A lot of what we see in orthodoxy, it could be Christian orthodoxy, Jewish orthodoxy. It could be, right? It could be Taoist alchemical orthodoxy. There's so much emphasis on striving, ironically, when it comes to the Taoist alchemy, because that's actually where a lot of this wisdom for me comes from. And again, like if we're just gonna love our fate, right? Amor fati, if we're gonna let our bodies guide the way and just listen and observe and partake in that passenger consciousness, then it's going to require a rethinking of free will. And there's a um, um, part of this comes with a paradox of the idea of choosing, where there really is no choice which is not the one choice. So there is no choosing and not choosing. There is only the one choice, and that choice is to constantly engage in this renewal, this process of enlightenment, for lack of a better word, rather than this destination, this process of renewal of right relation with the truth, with what is, where we're getting out of our heads, out of our minds, and allowing that soul to take its rightful seat in the control room, right? And just to illustrate this point, Bayo Akomolafe has this point on that he loves to point out, on agency, where they did this study on I think he asked the audience one time. He said, "What are three characteristics that you would think are the most important things for a Supreme Court justice to have?" And people say, uh, you know, temperance, compassion, yada yada, whatever. And he says, no, he says, actually, the thing which influences the strictness or leniency of someone who's in the position to judge. So he kind of uses that as an example to say, I fooled you, because that's not even a relevant question at all when you know what some of this research says. And this research seems to indicate that a judge's leniency or strictness in how they give their judgment has a profoundly significantly uh, statistically significant uh, um, correlation with the softness or firmness of the furniture of the chair in which they're sitting, or the furniture in which they're um, they're on, right? So it makes you think about how we're in constant relation with the colors in the room, the furniture, other emotions that are nonverbal, and so when we talk about interbeing, I mean it's big, it's really big. And so what I like to do is I like to take that concept and even widen it out further into something that is is more than just cognitive or human in the way that we think about it. It's more animistic. It's more that we're living in a living universe. Um, so we're coming to the end here. In fact, we're at the end, but um, one thing that it'd be lovely if you've experienced this in this conversation, you know. Um, but I've come to find in my relating with these concepts that when I touch the bottom, when I invoke the big T truth, when I fall into right relation, you could say when I like touch on, again, for lack of a better word, enlightenment, when I have that experience, what is that actually like? Right? Okay. Um, there is a response in the body. I just like to point that out, that hypothetically, the amygdala and the reptilian brain, they disengage because you realize there's nothing to fear, because nothing is a threat. When we talk about the memento mori, remember that you will die. Part of the question that I ask people is what this is doing is practicing for what's the state of mind? What's the state of mind that you'd like to be in the event that your car runs off a cliff on accident at 65 miles per hour, you're 400 feet up in the air, you know, how do you want to feel? And so that's in that moment. So that is part of what we're doing. And so is it morbid? Heck yeah, it's morbid, you know? But, yesterday you were riding on your horseback through town, and today you are a corpse in your coffin, right? Right. So for me, there's a softening of the muscles of the face. My mind stops talking. It just shuts up whatever it was saying, because something in me says, you don't have to worry about this. You don't have to even think about this. There's nothing to do. There's nowhere to go. There's nothing to be other than exactly what you are in this moment. And so there's a softening of the muscles of the face. Often there's a deep diaphragmatic breath that happens. There's a breath. There's a kind of like a sigh of relief. And I imagine, hypothetically, if you were to measure heart rate coherence and heart rate variability, in that moment, I would, there's falling into sync that happens. And so I invite you to kind of just listen. Again, remember how you feel that mental pressure come in? I think there's something that happens in the body as well when you hear that monkey mind talking, and you're like, oh, damn, there's that thing. How about you hush, and I'm just going to chill. And when you do that, the whole world kind of lights up. There's enhanced bodily awareness. Often, like, I'll feel my hands come alive, or you can feel your skin, or your vision can just become acute. And I like to just call it like a gentle joy. It's not like what in Chinese medicine we would call like a heart fire. It's not like you're manic or excited. It's just peace. And there's joy in that peace, right? So there is something that actually happens in the body when you touch the bottom. And the experience, remember, you're not holding your finger on the bottom of the pool, because you can't hold your breath that long, right? Because the love of God, the truth of the matter is just an unconditional, it's just total boundary dissolution. And, we may know that when we die, but here we're being called into this experience of these bodies with, paradoxically, this built-in story of separation between how we perceive our reality and what is the easiest, simplest, most divine, I guess, way to walk through that life. And that is to just do it. So, Laura may touch on some of this. But when we get to thinking about these things, we really, a lot of these words that are used in common, like spiritual or socially conscious language, they can actually point to the inherent story of separation that's being, what is there to be vulnerable about? What are we manifesting? Are we acting on are we like imposing our will upon the world? What is healing? Does healing take work? Right? This idea that healing, like, do the work, do the work, right? Pain and suffering. What are these things? Pain, pain is inevitable. What is suffering? What is suffering? What's our mind doing? Productivity. Again, the striving and work, striving. Goal setting, using our minds to project into the future what we want reality to be at some point in time, which does not exist. And maybe it does, because time doesn't exist. We're in some kind of, whatever. We can go quasi metaphysical about that, but that's not the point. The point is that we're using our mind to we're using our mind to project something into the future that is then like something that we do, something that we strive towards. And what happens if we don't meet our goals? How do we feel then, right? Problem solving. This is a big one. So it's called, sometimes referred to these days as like solutionism. Solutionism, the idea that we're constantly looking for like solutions rather than just being, rather than, they call it staying with the trouble of what it is. And I guess staying with the trouble of these of this kind of topic, of the one conversation, there is no trouble. There is no trouble. So that concludes this talk. Actually, I don't have a closure slide, but thank you. Chew on that if you want to. You're free to reach out to me. I'll edit this video to have some contact information at the end of it, but you can go to connorkeys.com, or you can email info@connorkeys.com. There's other things. There's a prayer group. There's a podcast. There's a spiritual talk show, the Coherent Soulcast, and so we'll put all that up. But I hope this has been. No, you know what? I don't care. That's. I'm being facetious, but I do hope this has been interesting, and I hope that it's a way of looking and relating to these ideas, these concepts, this way of being, in a way that's not overly stale and hopefully fresh. Is hopefully fresh for you. Yeah, and we will see you. I'll see you again in part 3. Laura will see you in part 2, and God bless you. Much love and many blessings.